Hi, it's Katrina. Ancient preserved brain. In 2008, archaeologists unearthed a human brain at an Iron Age site in York, England. Dating back some 2,600 years to the 6th century BC, it's the oldest preserved human brain ever found. Known as the Heslington brain, the organ was discovered inside of a skull that was found face down in a pit of wet clay. Project officer Rachel Cubbett told BBC that she noticed a yellow spongy material while peering through the hole at the base of the skull, adding it was unlike anything I had seen before. The brain belonged to a man who died between the ages of 26 and 45. Someone removed his head from his body using a small, sharp knife and probably buried it in the oxygen-free clay shortly after. This might help to explain why it was found in such good condition. The man's flesh, skin, and hair decomposed over time, yet his brain somehow stayed remarkably well preserved. Last year, a study found that certain types of brain filaments may have also helped to keep the Heslington brain intact, and that the man may have suffered from a disease that somehow affected its preservation. Chinchoro mummies. Did you know that the world's oldest mummies aren't actually from Egypt? The Chinchoro culture developed their preservation techniques around 5000 BC, roughly 2,000 years before the ancient Egyptians. Most people don't know about the Chinchoro mummies, even though they were first discovered a century ago, but it took decades to figure out their age. Located in the Atacama Desert in the part of Chile that borders with Peru, the Chinchorro culture emerged around 7000 BC. Locals have often come across these mummies when they were building or their dogs would pull one out, but no one really knew how significant these finds were. These prehistoric hunter-gatherers were the first people to artificially mummify their dead. At first, only babies and those born premature were preserved, perhaps due to the high infant mortality rate at the time. The practice eventually spread to adults. There were 5 different types of mummies in the Chinchorro culture, which spanned over 4,000 years. The 2 most common types are known as black and red mummies. Black mummies were made by taking a person's body apart and reassembling it, while red mummies were prepared by removing the internal organs through small incisions and letting the body dry out. The dead were then stuffed with twigs and reeds and wore wigs and clay masks. According to the BBC, they would also attach thick black hair onto the mummy's head and cover its face with clay and the mask with openings for the eyes and mouth. They would then paint the bodies using natural pigments from things like ochre, minerals, and iron oxide. Their settlements in Chile's Arica and Parinacota region were declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site this year. Experts are hoping this newfound status will help acquire the funds necessary to preserve the mummies, which are increasingly under the threat of being destroyed by time and the elements. The Holy Right Hand. Stephen I, also known as King Saint Stephen, was Hungary's first king. He was canonized in 1083 by Pope Gregory VII. When his remains were exhumed from his grave, his right fist remained perfectly preserved, even though Stephen had died decades earlier. It was severed from his body and preserved as a religious relic, known as the Holy Right Hand. The following year, a cleric named Mercurius stole Stephen's fist. At the time, stealing relics was so common that the practice even had a name, furta sacra. The stolen hand was soon recovered and spent several centuries at a monastic house. It moved around quite a bit after that, before ultimately ending up in the Hungarian city whose name I can't pronounce in 1420. The Ottomans occupied Hungary's central territories in the mid-16th century. During that time, the Holy Right Hand was kept in Croatia, Bosnia, and Vienna in Austria. It finally returned to Hungary in 1771, and in 1950 it ended up at its current home in St. Stephen's Basilica. Every year on August 20th, known as St. Stephen's Day or State Foundation Day, the Holy Right Hand is carried in a parade through the streets of Budapest. This tradition started in 1938, but was forbidden by the communist government in 1950. It resumed in 1988 when Hungary's communist regime fell. Visitors can view the Holy Right Hand by inserting a coin into a slot, which will light up the spooky display for about 1 minute. Oldest ghost drawing. The world's oldest ghost depiction was recently discovered in the British Museum's vaults on an ancient Babylonian clay tablet dating back 3,500 years. The British Museum acquired the artifact during the 19th century. Dr. Irving Finkel, curator of the museum's Middle Eastern department, spotted the long-overlooked object while studying ghost-related tablets. At least half of the tablet is missing, and what's left of it is small enough to fit in the palm of a person's hand. It features a barely visible carving of a woman pulling a grumpy-looking bearded man into the underworld by a rope. The text is written in cuneiform, an ancient writing system that originated in the Middle East. It describes a ritual spell for getting a pesky male ghost to go away. Finkel told Life Science that he believes the ritual detailed on the tablet would have been used to exorcise a ghost that refused to leave a household and had taken its antics beyond harmless fun and games. A massacre in the backyard. 2 years ago, Vitaly Kvasha began digging in his yard in Siberia near the Chinese border with plans to expand his home. He started finding bones, and not just a few of them. As the skeletal remains kept turning up, Kvasha put them in flour sacks and stacked them against his house. Over time, the homeowner found the bones of 60 people and counting when he spoke with the media in late 2019. Government experts who were dispatched to the site believe that the mass grave dates back to the 1930s, when the Stalinist regime imprisoned and massacred political rebels. He said that he was rushing to finish digging before winter arrived and the soil froze. He had just removed 3 bones from the ground and knew that there were probably more to come. Kvasha seemed more annoyed than shocked. By then, he was ready to get the job done and over with so that he could proceed with his home renovations. Joseph Stalin committed horrifying atrocities in his bid to squash any and all opposition. Anyone who dared to speak out against the Soviet dictator was forced into a system of remote labor camps called gulags. Many prisoners died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and other effects of the brutal conditions, which came with 14-hour workdays in extreme weather and meager nourishment at best. Executions were also common at these hellish establishments. Many people think that the Russian government avoids facing this shameful historical chapter. Based on his experience with finding the bones, Kvasha thinks this is entirely possible. He repeatedly asked the authorities to help him dig up the dozens of human remains on his property, but they allegedly claimed that they didn't have the money and resources to assist with the task. They only agreed to pick up the bones after Kvasha finished digging them out. This is much different from what happens in many countries when people make archaeological discoveries. Not only are people required to report their findings to the authorities by law, they are often discouraged from continuing to dig. This is so that professionals can study the objects in their proper context and excavate them without damaging them. So it makes sense that the Russian government's apparent lack of interest in studying the bones seems like an attempt to hide from its dark past. I wanted to give a big shout out to Haley Landry and Ubaldo Myers, who are some of our longest supporters. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the Origins Explained family. Teotihuacan Stone Faces. The ancient city of Teotihuacan thrived in what is now central Mexico during the first half of the first millennium AD. Archaeologists have found hundreds of small stone faces among its ruins and believe that they were buried with the dead. Measuring just 6 to 9 inches wide, the ghoulish masks feature gaping mouths and big empty eyes that seem to stare blankly ahead. At one time, researchers thought that they were manufactured within the city and that they were made from jadeite. A 2014 study that examined 150 of the faces revealed that they were crafted at workshops far south of the city, although experts haven't pinpointed their exact origins. Their makers used limestone, serpentinite, travertine, and a rare volcanic rock called liswanite. The masks were polished with quartz, which isn't found near Teotihuacan, and helped tip experts off that they were made elsewhere. These findings proved that everything scholars previously wrote about the stone faces was untrue, according to anthropologist Jane Walsh. The masks and other artifacts found at Teotihuacan also reflect its far-reaching trade connections and vast wealth. Saint Anthony's tongue. Saint Anthony was a man of Portuguese descent who became a priest in Italy during the 13th century. He was sickly for much of his early priesthood and spent a lot of time in the hospital. But when his talent for speaking was discovered, he began traveling throughout Italy and France, delivering powerful sermons despite his health issues. The papal court praised the man's speeches, calling them the jewel of the Bible. Pope Gregory IX declared Anthony the Ark of the Testament. He was canonized shortly after he died from edema in 1231. 32 years later, Plans were made to move St. Anthony's remains from their original resting place to a new basilica that was built in his honor. When his body was exhumed, his tongue was still intact. It was reportedly wet and glistening, despite the rest of his body having decomposed. This was seen as proof of St. Anthony's gift for words and for teaching the Word of God. His tongue, jaw, and forearm were removed and put on display at the Basilica of St. Anthony of Padua, where they remain today. The rest of his body was entombed in a nearby chapel. Imagine having parts of your body exhumed, preserved, and put on display. What do you think of this practice? Creepy or normal? Let me know in the comments below. Mutilated Stone Age skulls. In late 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of 2 human skulls and the skeleton of a young goat at the Cueva de la Dehesilla cave site on the Iberian Peninsula. The bones date back to sometime between 4,800 and 4000 BC, during the Middle Neolithic period of the Late Stone Age. They were found among structures and other artifacts from an ancient funerary ritual, including a stone altar, a hearth, ceramic pottery, stone objects, charred plant remains, and a stone slab called a stele. Both human skulls belong to adults, one male and one female. There is a depression in the frontal lobe of the woman's cranium, which also bears signs of decapitation and trepanation, a surgery that involved drilling a hole into the skull. The skulls and the goat skeleton were found on one side of a wall separating them from the altar and hearth. Researcher Daniel Garcia Rivero said that the differential treatment of the remains is a first among Neolithic funerary rites on the Iberian Peninsula. He further explained that the discovery is changing researchers' understandings of the death rituals that went on during one of the least understood Neolithic periods in the region. Ofuka Cho Mass grave. Last year, archaeologists excavated a series of strange circular holes containing the remains of 1,500 people and animals at the Ofuka Cho site in Osaka, Japan. Dating back to the mid to late 19th century, during Japan's Edo period, the bizarre burials contain humans, pigs, horses, and at least one cat. Officials discovered the graves near a busy train station during the construction of a new skyscraper. There were no grave goods at the site, leading experts to believe that the people buried there couldn't afford nicer tombs. Some of the remains bear signs of disease, so it's also possible that the individuals perished during an epidemic that swept through the area during the 1800s. In addition to finding holes crammed with bones, the team unearthed coffins filled with several bodies each. This further suggests that the graves contain the victims of a deadly disease. City officials said that the burials likely belonged to young people and children from the local area, which was a farming region when they died. It was the first discovery of a historical cemetery in Osaka, and its contents provide insight into the past burial customs of ordinary people. Scientists are studying the remains in an attempt to learn more about what killed the grave's occupants. The severed head of Saint Catherine of Siena. Saint Catherine of Siena lived during the 14th century in Siena, Italy. She began having religious visions at just 7 years old, when she saw Jesus on a throne surrounded by saints. When she was a teen, she vowed to remain a virgin for life and devoted herself entirely to prayer and worship. Her family ignored her wishes and tried to marry her off, so she cut off her hair and became a nun. Catherine experienced the stigmata at age 28 while praying at a crucifix. 5 red rays shot out of it, piercing her hands, feet, and heart. People saw her levitating during prayer, and one priest claimed that the Holy Communion flew out of his hand and into her mouth. Catherine died in Rome when she was just 33 years old after having a stroke that paralyzed her from the waist down. The people of her hometown wanted her body, but knew they wouldn't be able to sneak it past the Roman guards. So they removed her head and put it in a paper bag, hoping they could slip by without raising suspicion. But the guards stopped them. The thieves prayed to Catherine to protect them, and when the guards looked into the bag, all they saw were rose petals. The head had rematerialized by the time the townspeople made it back to Siena. This is considered Catherine's final miracle. Today, her head sits in a reliquary in the Basilica San Domenico, and her thumb is kept nearby. Catherine's foot is rumored to be somewhere in Venice, and the rest of her body is in Rome. Karakoto. Nicknamed the Black City, Karakoto is an ancient walled city in the Gobi Desert of Inner Mongolia. This incredible historic site was once ruled by the infamous Genghis Khan. Dating back to 1032, it was built along the Silk Road and was a flourishing trade center and cultural hub under the Western Xia Empire. During the 13th century, Mongol ruler Genghis Khan began a series of military campaigns to take Western Xia territory. He took Karakoto in 1226. The city adopted the name Siena and continued to thrive under Genghis Khan's rule. In 1372, soldiers for China's Ming dynasty approached the city and surrounded the Mongol king Karabator. They diverted the Black River, Karakoto's only water source, cutting its plants and population off from much-needed hydration. Then they waited. Weakened by deadly thirst, Karabator's soldiers didn't stand a chance against the invading Ming warriors, who ruthlessly slaughtered everyone within the city's walls. Karakoto was ultimately abandoned and fell into ruins. Protected from looters because of its remote location, the site was rediscovered in the early 20th century. Thousands of texts in the ancient Tangut language and paintings were found. The 5 pagodas and nearly 33-foot-high walls that surrounded the city are still standing, along with several other crumbling buildings. Train Cemetery. On the outskirts of an abandoned transportation hub near the mesmerizing salt flats of Uyuni in Bolivia, there is a collection of rusting locomotives and rotting train cars. Known as the Cementerio de Trenes, or the Great Train Graveyard, this site is the product of a 19th century plan to expand the Uyuni region's train network. The project never came to fruition, as you can see. As the local mining industry began to dry up, developers ran into negotiation conflicts with other countries and experienced increasingly complicated technical problems. The plans ground to a screeching halt, leaving more than 100 trains parked in the middle of the desert. Most of the vehicles were imported from Britain during the early 20th century. They are heavily rusted from the region's salty winds, and they've also been vandalized. The property is open to visitors, many of whom stop by during a trip to the salt flats. A seemingly random train graveyard in the remote, scorching hot climate is strange enough. To make things even weirder, there are several hotels in the region that are made almost entirely out of salt, making a visit to Uyuni anything but ordinary. An Immortal Plant. The Namib Desert in southern Africa is one of the world's oldest and driest deserts. It's also home to one of the world's longest living plants, known as Welwitschia. This strange species has just 2 leaves, which can grow for thousands of years. The oldest Welwitschia plants are thought to date back at least 3,000 years to the beginning of the Iron Age, according to the New York Times. A recent study examined the species' genome in an attempt to figure out how and why it lives so long. Researchers found that around 86 million years ago, Welwitschia's genome doubled due to a mistake during the cell division process. At the time, the region was experiencing an especially dry period. Extreme conditions like this are often associated with genome duplication, according to lead study author Tao Wan. Co-author Andrew Leach says this resulted in a lot of junk DNA called retrotransposons. Even worse, the expanded genome demanded a lot of extra energy from the plant just to stay alive. Between 1 and 2 million years ago, Welwitschia responded to increasingly harsh conditions by silencing its retrotransposons through a process called methylation. This decreased the amount of energy the plant needed to survive, even with its huge genome. As plant biologist Jim Liebensmack pointed out to the New York Times, the bizarre plant's genetic resilience could possibly provide useful information for improving agriculture, particularly as global temperatures increase. Immortal plant life in the harshest environments? The capabilities of DNA are pretty fascinating. A lost Libyan civilization. In 2011, scientists revealed the discovery of over 100 ancient fortresses in the Sahara Desert in southwestern Libya. Dating back between 1 and 500 AD, these settlements were inhabited by a mysterious but advanced civilization called the Garamantes. Researchers identified the sites by examining satellite photographs and aerial images dating back to the 1950s and 60s. In 2011, a team of experts traveled to the fortresses, which are located 620 miles south of the Libyan capital of Tripoli. There they found pottery samples, confirming that the Garamantes once occupied the site. The archaeologists noticed that their buildings were remarkably preserved, but they didn't get a chance to explore as in-depth as they wanted to. Unfortunately, the Libyan civil war cut the expedition short. At first glance, the ruins have a Romanesque feel, but they are not Roman at all, as the architecture belonged to a powerful African kingdom. The ruins were extremely tightly packed, with as many as 10 village-sized settlements being crammed into a 1.5 square mile area, almost like a modern city. Scientific knowledge of the Garamantes is limited. Violence and civil unrest in Libya has prevented thorough research from taking place, and the country has a limited budget for investing in archaeology. Going on what little they have to learn from, experts have determined that the Garamantes had their own writing system. They also made high-quality textiles and were metalworkers. Their most impressive achievement, however, was their advanced irrigation system, which enabled the society to grow plants, even in the middle of the desert. Aralkum Desert Ship Graveyard. Before the 1960s, the Aral Sea was the world's fourth largest inland sea. Once home to a thriving fishing industry, it straddled the border between modern-day Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. That all changed when the Soviet Union diverted the two main rivers feeding the sea to supply farms with water. The once vast body of water began to rapidly dry up, leaving behind a salty, poisonous wasteland in its wake. As the sea shrunk, its salt content reached toxic levels and killed off its marine life. With no more money to be made from fishing, people began to hightail it out of town for better prospects elsewhere. Most of what was once the Aral Sea is now the Aralkum Desert, and it's littered with dozens of rusting fishing boats that former residents abandoned. The decaying ships represent the distant memory of a place that once had a thriving economy before it was replaced by the desolate and eerie scenery that gives the feeling of some kind of post-apocalyptic movie set. Most of the ghost ships sit at the edge of former harbor cities and seaside towns, near clusters of derelict buildings. The few people who still live in the area are plagued by health problems from the toxic dust that blows around. But in a surprising turn of events, the Aral Sea is once again being fed by the rivers that were diverted away from it. Its salt content has decreased, and fish have returned. For now, it's uncertain whether the sea will be restored to its former glory and perhaps replace the depressing sight of rotting ships. Film City. If you drive several hours from Qatar's capital city of Doha into the Qatari desert, you might stumble upon a deserted, ancient-looking Bedouin-style village filled with minarets, a mosque, and mud brick houses with wooden doors. The exact explanation behind its presence is somewhat of a mystery, depending on who you ask. Known as Film City, this site is thought to be an abandoned film set that was built for a TV series or a movie. It was once a fishing village, but was apparently abandoned during the 1970s. In 2009, the village was partially rebuilt, presumably for filming purposes, although the stories vary and nobody seems to know what to believe. The deserted nature of Film City is eerie enough on its own, but it gets even creepier when you think about the vast, seemingly limitless desert that surrounds it. Visitors are unlikely to see a car drive by or cross paths with another human, except for the security guard who oversees the property, and getting there requires a four-wheel drive vehicle. And now for number 4. But first, want to give a big shout out to Britannia Renee and Ashley O. Thanks so much for supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos about amazing and mysterious discoveries. Old Skagen Church. Sometime between 1355 and 1387, a Gothic-style church dedicated to St. Lawrence of Rome was built just outside of Skagen, Denmark. Known as the Old Skagen Church, it belonged to the Danish crown until 1459, and it is one of the area's oldest buildings. Over the centuries, the region underwent a process called desertification, which is kind of what it sounds like. Sand swept in from the nearby Rabjerg Mile Dune and began accumulating around the brick church. By the late 18th century, the building's entrance became buried regularly. Whenever they wanted to attend a service, worshippers had to dig their way in through the sand. Eventually, the problem became too much to deal with. The church's contents were removed to protect them from damage, and in 1795, Denmark's king allowed the church to close. Most of the structure is either destroyed or buried. All that can be seen today is the main tower, which sticks up out of the sand. The National Museum of Denmark owns the site and maintains the tower as a navigational landmark. Very limited excavations have been carried out on the rest of the building. Local authorities believe that the floor and altar are still there, swallowed by sand, but they haven't investigated to confirm their suspicions. Huge prehistoric cemetery. While hunting for dinosaur remains at a site called Gobero in Niger in 2000, a group of scientists stumbled upon a large human graveyard dating as far back as 10,000 years. It's the biggest known cemetery ever found in the Sahara. In addition to around 200 human graves, the remains of fish, crocodiles, and other animals were buried there. Evidence indicates that the site was occupied during two different periods separated by a 1,000-year gap. The groups that lived there, the Kiphians and Tenarians, left behind an array of grave goods in addition to the remains buried at the cemetery. Researchers have learned a lot about what day-to-day life was like for people from these groups based on the artifacts, which include bone jewelry, arrowheads, and harpoons. There were numerous bizarre burials, including a man whose head was placed in a pot, and another who was laid to rest on top of a turtle shell, as well as a woman who was buried facing two children. The women and two children were likely buried on top of a bed of flowers, as evidenced by pollen found in their graves. Even more strangely, the tools and animals at Gobero seemed out of place for the modern Sahara climate. This is because they originate from a time known as the period of the Green Sahara, also known as an African humid period, during which changes in the Earth's orbit brought more rain to the region, resulting in an uptick in vegetation, water, and the life forms that come with it. Pretty amazing what can be learned from burial sites, even details about dramatic shifts in climate over time. An abandoned prison. In 1952, the U.S. government built the Boron Air Force Station in the Mojave Desert. Located in Kern County, California, the site remained in operation until 1975, when it was decommissioned. 4 years later, the abandoned collection of buildings was turned into a federal prison. Boron Federal Prison could accommodate up to 540 prisoners and had 25 units for staff members. There were several industrial buildings at the site where inmates assembled military vehicles and repaired forklifts for the U.S. Army. Like many low-security prisons, Boron had barrack-style housing instead of actual cells. But the facility was unique because it had almost no security, even compared to other minimum security prisons. It wasn't surrounded by a fence, there were no guard towers, and the doors didn't lock. But why? The property was so remote, the prisoners generally weren't dangerous to the general public, although there were a few instances where inmates escaped. Boron closed in 2000 amid budget cuts, and the building that housed the inmates was demolished in 2018. Several decrepit buildings are left standing at the site, which is still owned by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They're in a noticeable state of disrepair and are not exactly safe to explore, so trespassing is strictly prohibited. Lake Dolores Water Park. During the 1950s, a California businessman named Bob Myers built a private water park for his extended family off Interstate 15 in Newberry Springs. It first opened its doors in 1962 and eventually evolved into a 250-acre recreational facility that was made open to the public. The property went by several different names over the years, including Discovery Water Park, Rockahoopla Water Park, and Lake Dolores Water Park. These names reflect buyers and other owners' numerous attempts to rebrand and reopen the site, and bad luck seemed to plague the business. Each time someone tried to clean up the water park's image in hopes of drawing a resurgence of visitors, it seems like something got in the way. Byers held onto the business until 1990, when he sold it to an investment group who upgraded the equipment and reimagined the park with a 1950s theme. But their luck wasn't any better than his. After operating for just 3 seasons and accumulating copious amounts of debt, the park closed yet again. One more buyer tried and failed to turn the site into a success, and the property has been closed since 2004. The weathered, graffiti-covered equipment and buildings left behind are not only an eyesore, they are also said to be dangerous. There are rumors that the park will reopen yet again, but this hasn't happened. As of September, the property was listed on the market for $11 million. If you happen to be in the market for an abandoned, bad luck-plagued desert water park. Bronze Age Burial. While digging a pond in 2018, workers at the Tetney Golf Club in Lincolnshire, England, stumbled upon an ancient wooden coffin. The waterlogged burial contained the remains of a man holding an axe. The discovery shocked the club's owner, Mark Caswell, who told the press that his family had farmed the land for years and never encountered anything like it. Experts were called to the scene, where they found the coffin in pieces and at risk of further falling apart in the summer heat. To prevent further damage, they rushed to excavate and preserve it. Made from a hollowed-out tree, the 10-foot-long casket represented what archaeologists called an unusual form of burial that was practiced briefly around 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. The man inside died during his late 30s or early 40s. He was around 5 foot 9 inches tall, which was unusually tall for the time, and his bones bore signs of osteoarthritis, which likely resulted from hard work rather than old age. A lot of effort was put into his burial, indicating that he was a high-ranking member of his community. Before the team could preserve the coffin or the perfectly preserved axe found inside it, they had to thoroughly research the materials to prevent damaging them. It took 3 years to treat the artifacts and reassemble the coffin, which was like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, in the words of Ian Panter, who heads the York Archaeological Trust. It was recently announced that the preservation work is expected to take 2 more years. When it's finished, the artifacts will go on display at the Lincoln Collection Museum. Giant skeletons. In 2017, archaeologists in southeastern China's Shandong province unearthed the 5,000-year-old skeletons of several so-called giants. The individuals were found among over 200 graves in the Neolithic village of Jiaojia. One male was 6 feet 3 inches tall, which may not seem that tall by today's standards, but 5,000 years ago, they would have been literal giants, kind of like the guy I just told you about with the axe. Others measured 5 feet 11 inches. Their heights were calculated based on their bones alone, meaning they were probably slightly taller in flesh and blood. Even today they would be tall, but they lived when people were much shorter on average, making them extraordinarily tall for their time. For example, in 2015, the typical 18-year-old male in the region was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and the national average was 5 feet 8 inches tall, despite people having better access to nutrition nowadays. Researchers believe that the ancient people were from the Longshan culture, which was known to eat a robust diet. The increased availability of food that came with the transition to agriculture changed their physique, and the giant men were buried in larger graves, indicating that they were of high-ranking status in their society, which would have given them access to the best foods available at the time. This place must have been amazing back in the day. Jiaojia's houses had separate bedrooms and kitchens, which are yet another testament to the comfortable lifestyle its residents enjoyed. The village was only partially excavated when the discovery was announced, meaning that there may be more surprising discoveries in store. Lost ghost ships. 24 World War II-era ghost ships recently surfaced in the Pacific Ocean following seismic activity from an underwater volcano off the Japanese coast. Located 800 miles southwest of Tokyo, Fukutoku Okanoba has been erupting since August, causing the seabed to rise around the island of Iwo Jima. Surprisingly, it has also brought up the ships. Iwo Jima is part of the Bonin Islands, which are prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The ships that recently appeared near the shoreline are the remains of Japanese transport vessels that U.S. forces sank after the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. Iwo Jima was a major World War II battle. For 36 days, 70,000 U.S. Marines fought against a force of around 20,000 Japanese soldiers. It was one of World War II's bloodiest battles, killing all but 216 Japanese troops who were taken prisoner. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and another 20,000 were wounded. There was no port at Iwo Jima, so the Marines scuttled the ships parallel to the island's shoreline to create a breakwater. Now that they've resurfaced, they'll probably remain in place for a while. Iwo Jima is littered with unexploded bombs and grenades, so nobody lives there and people rarely visit. For safety's sake, the Japanese government will probably decide to leave the ships in place rather than attempt to remove or scrap them. Maya Canoe. Archaeologists working at the Chichen Itza Mayan ruins in southern Mexico have just discovered a wooden canoe thought to be over 1,000 years old. The nearly intact vessel was found outside the ancient city in a freshwater pool called a cenote. Perhaps you've been to one. During routine excavations ahead of the planned construction of a tourist train route. Measuring over 5 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, the boat may have been used for transporting water from the cenote or leaving ritual offerings at the site, according to a statement from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. It's the first complete canoe of its kind ever found in the area. The next step is for experts to analyze the wood to determine its age. They believe that the canoe dates back to sometime between 830 and 950 AD, but until they perform reliable scientific tests, they can't say for sure. Scientists will also create a 3D model of the boat for further study, and so that replicas can be made. The Mayan civilization peaked during that time period, with dozens of cities established throughout modern-day southern Mexico and other parts of Central America, including Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. But the empire mysteriously collapsed toward the end of this golden age, most likely from a combination of warfare, drought, overpopulation, and who knows what else. Roman sculptures. While excavating an abandoned medieval church in Buckinghamshire, England recently, archaeologists unearthed a pair of complete Roman sculptures depicting a man and a woman. And this is just one of many incredible finds. In addition to the sculptures, the team uncovered a hexagonal glass Roman jug thought to be more than 1,000 years old. They've also removed around 3,000 skeletons from the site already. These extremely rare finds turned up at the old St. Mary's Church in Stoke Mandeville. Lead archaeologist Dr. Rachel Wood said that it would have been surprising enough to find even just a stone head or a set of shoulders, but that it was even more astonishing to find two statues with both their head and shoulders intact. She further explained that the discovery is helping experts better understand what the site was used for before the church was built in 1080. They believe that it also functioned as a Roman mausoleum. This place has been extremely important to people for thousands of years, so uncovering all of the layers of history will be quite the process. A bird that hunted koalas. Around 25 million years ago, Australia was home to an eagle-like raptor that fed on other birds, as well as possums and koalas. Equipped with long legs, widely spaced feet, and short, robust wings, it was adapted to hunting in the forest. Scientists unearthed the bird's fossilized skeleton in 2016 at Lake Pinpa in southern Australia. The salt lake dried up a long time ago, and the region is now a desert with a harsh, dry climate. But when the bird was alive, the area was a rainforest. The newly identified species, dubbed Archaeoherax sylvestris, is a surprising find. At the time of its existence, avian predators near the top of the food chain, like hawks and eagles, occurred in small numbers. Finding just one eagle bone from the period would be rare, according to a statement from paleontologist Dr. Trevor Worthy. Researcher Ellen Mather explained that A. sylvestris was the largest eagle in Australia during its time. With a 6-inch footspan, it was capable of swooping down and snatching up prey as big as a small dog. Like today's forest-dwelling eagles, it had short wings that enabled it to navigate in a habitat that was densely packed with trees. What do you think about birds snatching up koalas as a snack? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to learn about more amazing discoveries. World War II bunker in a Roman fort. One of Britain's best preserved Roman forts can be found at the Alderney Nunnery in the Channel Islands. It was built in the 4th century and has passed through multiple hands. The property also functioned as a fort and barracks during medieval times, and the Germans used it during World War II. Its history is only now coming to light. Excavations began during the 1930s, but it wasn't until 2011 that archaeologists confirmed long-held suspicions that the fort dates back to Roman times. After 4 years of digging, they determined that it was built shortly before the empire collapsed. The Romans probably put the fort there during a time of panic, when they were scrambling to protect their territory against invaders. Even nearly 1,500 years after it was built, this site was ideal for military use, thanks to its 10-foot thick walls. The Germans evicted the entire population when they took control of the island in 1940. Then they built fortifications, bunkers, tunnels, and 2 forced labor and concentration camps. Archaeologists are still excavating the site, where they recently unearthed a series of buildings, drains, and other features that the Nazis implemented after they occupied the island. Evidence shows that the Germans installed a bunker precisely within the walls of the Roman fort. Interestingly, they left one area alone completely. Known as the sunroom, it may hold important clues about what happened to the site after the Roman Empire collapsed. The findings are causing experts to wonder if there ever was a convent on the property like they've long believed. It'll take them some time to figure it out as they continue to disentangle the history behind the jumbled mess of artifacts and buildings spanning nearly 2,000 years. Ancient pottery lessons. Fingerprints that were left behind on a 5,000-year-old clay pottery fragment suggest that ancient people enjoyed taking arts and crafts lessons just like we do today. The artifact bears the fingerprints of a 13-year-old boy and 2 adult men, indicating that more experienced potters taught beginners how to sculpt clay. The evidence was found at a complex of ancient buildings in Scotland's Orkney Islands. Ceramics specialists noticed the fingerprints while examining the site's vast collection of pottery shards. By analyzing the prints, experts were able to pinpoint the age and gender of the people they belonged to. The findings suggest that at least 1 and possibly 2 teenage boys worked under the watchful eye of 2 men, who were around 19 years old. Only 8 fingerprints have been found among the thousands of pottery fragments collected at the site. Similar evidence of pottery lessons that was found on Bronze Age vessels from the Levant shows that numerous cultures took a hands-on approach to teaching the craft, which I guess isn't very surprising. After all, what better way to learn than from the guidance of a seasoned pro? Imperial Roman tiles. Archaeologists recently began excavating a 3rd century Roman bathhouse at the Carlisle Cricket Club in England. They've already turned up numerous fascinating artifacts, including pottery and a ring. But the most exciting find so far is a collection of floor tiles bearing an imperial stamp, indicating that the site had close ties with a Roman emperor. Lead archaeologist Frank Giecco told the press that the Roman legions and auxiliaries were known for stamping their floor tiles, but the ones found at the site were at the top of the pile. In other words, they bear the mark of the imperial court, the emperor and his people. The tiles date back to the rule of Septimius Severus, a wealthy man from Africa who seized power in 193 AD. He ruled until 211, when he fell ill and died in the city of Eboracum, known today as York. Although nobody can say for sure whether Severus visited the bathhouse in Carlisle, it's known that he was in Britain at the time. In addition to finding his signature tiles, the archaeological team identified an inscription from the ruler's wife on the building. All signs point towards Severus at least passing through the area at one point or another. Industrial winery. Around 1,500 years ago during the Byzantine era, an industrial winery was built south of Tel Aviv in Yavne, Israel. Using sophisticated equipment, it produced around 2 million liters of wine every year and exported it throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeologists who recently discovered the site were taken aback by its size. The team found 5 wine presses spread throughout a 1-kilometer squared area, kilns that were used for firing wine jars, and warehouses where the wine was stored and bottled. The product was called Gaza and Ashkelon wine after the ports, where it was loaded onto ships and exported to Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Excavation director John Seligman told the BBC that the wine was known for its quality. In addition to being a recreational drink, it was a source of nutrition for many people, as well as an alternative to drinking water, which was often contaminated. Another ancient industrial-scale winery was recently discovered in northern Iraq. Dating back 2,700 years to the time of the Assyrian kings, the facility consists of 14 installations that were used to press grapes, extract juice, and ferment it into wine. These discoveries show that our appreciation for wine is timeless, and that some things never go out of style. The Great Ant City, an abandoned megalopolis which features vast subterranean highways, paths, and gardens, was found buried beneath the earth in Brazil. But it didn't belong to a lost civilization of people. This megacity had been left behind by ants. Scientists decided to investigate what the subterranean city built by a colony of ants really looked like, so they poured cement inside to create a mold. It was so large it took 3 full days, using over 10 tons of cement. Once the cement had settled, they painstakingly excavated the underground city, revealing quite an incredible feat of engineering. They removed masses of earth to reveal something so magnificent it's been described as the ant equivalent to the Great Wall of China. As it turns out, ant builders rival humans. The scientists found highways that connected each individual chamber, as well as side roads and avenues leading to pits of refuse, gardens, and so much more. This city actually looked as though it had been designed by professional architects. There were even ventilation ports. In total, the Great Ant City covered somewhere around 150 square feet and went over 24 feet down into the ground. To create their city, the colony had to move over 40 tons of soil to the surface. Of course, using only their sheer strength. Chicken dinosaur. The most famous dinosaur in the world, the T-Rex, lived 80 million years ago. It's known today for having a starring role as the apex predator in the Jurassic Park films, its enormous jaws, tiny arms, and for being a terrifying killing machine. But a new study looking at one of the ancient ancestors of the T-Rex has proved that this creature wasn't always so scary. A Welsh discovery has led to researchers with the University of Birmingham uncovering the remains of an ancient ancestor directly related to the T-Rex that was only the size of a chicken. A terrifying chicken, though, I have to admit. You don't want a chicken with huge razor-sharp teeth and claws coming after you. The dinosaur, recently named Pendraig milnerae, lived sometime between 200 and 215 million years ago. That was way before the Tyrannosaurus rex showed up. And even though it was a relative and came before the T-Rex, it was obviously much smaller and was not as ferocious. While the T-Rex was around 40 feet tall, the Pendraig was only about 27 inches. However, it did have a tail of around 3 feet long. Who knew our friendly farm friends were so closely related to the greatest dinosaurs? Stingless bees. In California, a 4-year-old girl made an amazing discovery. This curious child accidentally found a very rare type of bee that was previously thought to be extinct in the United States. Annika Arnaut from Palo Alto stumbled upon 2 hives of stingless bees, insects that are normally found only in Brazil and a few other countries. According to scientists, these bees were believed to have been extinct in the US for over 70 years. But they were wrong. The stingless bees were still around. It just took a chance encounter and a little girl exploring to find them. The bee colonies were sent to the Department of Food and Agriculture Plant Pest Diagnostics branch to be inspected. Scientists found out that these stingless bees are descendants of different bees that had been brought to the United States to be pollinators in the 1950s. Back then, the Department of Agriculture was bringing in foreign bugs to help with vegetable and fruit crops. According to Martin Hauser, an insect biosystematist, the Department of Agriculture requested stingless bees from Brazil, then used them in Florida, Utah, and California. However, within just 1 year, all of the bees were thought to have died. Now we know that the bees didn't die, they just went incognito. Plus, even if you saw them, the average person would probably not know to report them. Where are you supposed to report strange animals? If you're wondering how these bees are different from the ones you see buzzing around in your garden, they don't have stingers. Instead of stinging, female bees of this kind simply bite. It still hurts, but it doesn't kill the bee. The warping crust. Scientists have made a very strange discovery regarding the crust of our planet. They have found that the staggering rate at which our planet is losing its ice has caused the Earth's crust to warp. And according to the experts, this could have a catastrophic effect around the globe. The Earth's crust is a very important part of our world. It's a zone of dry rock that's not quite as stable as some people think. Scientists compare the crust to a piece of wood floating in the water. As things change above and below, the crust fluctuates. The intense weight of glacier ice usually keeps the crust in place. But as more and more ice melts, that pressure is released and the crust rises up. Normally, this takes thousands and thousands of years, but it seems to be happening faster. Scientists have found that the crust is deforming both vertically and horizontally, and the warping is not only in places where the ice is melting. The crust is warping hundreds of miles away from where there is any ice. The best analogy is a memory foam pillow. When you lift your head, the depressions in the pillow slowly rise until the pillow is fluffy again. The same thing is happening with the Earth's crust. The crust is the pillow and the ice is your head. As the ice melts, the crust rises. What this means is that the surface of the planet is going to dramatically change in the next years and could result in coastal cities like New York being completely underwater in less than a century. Old Mike. The discovery of a corpse in the early 1900s proved to be one of the creepiest mysteries that is still unsolved even today. Old Mike was a traveling salesman who often showed up in the town of Prescott, Arkansas. No one knew his real name. They just called him Old Mike. On April 12, 1911, Old Mike was discovered dead in the middle of a park in the city of Prescott, lying underneath a tree. The coroner's report said that he died either from a stroke or a heart attack during the night. The townspeople didn't quite know what to do with him. Since they were unsure of who to contact, they went ahead and took him to the funeral home. The local funeral home then had his body embalmed. but no one came to claim him to have him buried. In 1911, it cost a lot of money to bury a person. Nobody wanted to pay to bury the stranger, so the funeral home put him up in the window, like a bizarre Christmas display, in hopes that somebody would walk by and recognize him, then pay for his burial. Nobody ever did recognize old Mike. He sat in front of the Cornish funeral home for more than 60 years before he was finally put in the ground. By then, he had become a landmark in the city. People from far and wide came to get a glimpse of the mysterious body, and that was the legacy of old Mike. He was finally buried in modern days when it became too inappropriate to have a dead body sitting in your storefront window. And now for some mysterious things from space. But first, want to give a big thank you to Mary Holsizer and Louise Turcott. You guys are awesome! If you are new here, welcome! And be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. We've got lots more videos coming up. Radio waves. In October of 2021, astronomers detected strange and unusual radio waves unlike anything they have ever detected before. It's true that radio emissions are very common throughout the universe. Everything from planets to stars generate radio emissions. Even black holes do it. But these emissions are usually identifiable. Scientists can't tell what's making these radio waves and why. This time, scientists are clueless. From what astronomers have said so far, the radio waves are reaching Earth from somewhere near the center of our galaxy, the Milky Way. The radio waves were detected by astronomers in Australia using their ASCAP radio telescope. One of the main theories right now is that the radio signals are coming from a new type of stellar object, some kind of cosmic thing that scientists have yet to see. According to Zitang Wang from the School of Physics at the University of Sydney, whatever the object is, it's extremely polarized and it oscillates. This means the signal is moving toward us, kind of like a corkscrew. If you have your hopes up for aliens, it's not quite there yet. The most realistic possibility is that these signals are coming from some type of pulsar, a spinning neutron star emitting massive beams of energy. But right now, scientists are still unsure. What do you think is sending radio waves out from the center of our galaxy? Is it a celestial object or is it aliens? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Terrifying spiders. This new research was published by the British Ecological Society. They performed an experiment in which they put spiders in front of other spiders to see what happened. In almost every single case, these spiders were so scared of the other spiders that they either jumped into the air or ran away as quickly as possible. The study was nicknamed arachnophobia. Its purpose was to look at how jumping spiders process threats. To do this, scientists had to take jumping spiders and then place objects in front of them to see how they reacted. They used objects like an image of a circle, random household items, and then more lifelike things. The more that the object looked like a creature, the more the spider got scared. For example, an ordinary box didn't frighten the spider, but when the scientists added things that looked like eyes and legs, the spider became more nervous. Finally, the scientists put the specimen of a dead spider in front of the living spider. It was so terrified that it ran away as quickly as its 8 legs could carry it. And this experiment had the same result every single time. We now know that humans aren't the only ones scared of spiders. Spiders are just as terrified of themselves as we are of them. Maggot Power. When Pam Mitchell cut her left heel, she never imagined she would become a medical miracle. The small cut got infected, grew over 2 inches wide, and it ripped open down to the bone. Another wound developed on her foot, and the infection started to spread. Pam's doctor told her that it was beyond saving, and that she would have to get her foot amputated. The antibiotics the doctors were prescribing did nothing to help. She was considering a very dangerous bone marrow transplant to save her foot when she learned about the possibility of maggots healing her. And yes, the wriggling, gross kind of maggots. Her doctor was appalled at the idea and said it was one step short of witchcraft. But Pam went out and found a specialized dermatologist who would perform a maggot procedure, something that they used to do in medieval times. Basically, old medicine is new again. The dermatologist introduced 600 living maggots into the wound on Pam's foot. The maggots were then sealed in gauze and left to do their business for 2 days. Just try to imagine having maggots wriggling around in your skin. Ugh. Yet to everyone's surprise, the procedure worked. After 10 treatments of inserting maggots into her wound, it healed. The maggots removed dead tissue, exposed healthy tissue, and worked even better than antibiotic cream. This might come back as a more popular medical solution. Plastic surgeons are already using leeches, and it might become way more mainstream than we can even imagine. The long-tongue moth. A new species of moth has been discovered, and it is weird. It's called the hawk moth, and it is found in Madagascar. It's a perfectly ordinary moth, except for one exceptional detail. It has the longest tongue out of any insect currently known to scientists. The moth's tongue can measure up to an outstanding 11.8 inches long. But why is there a moth flying around with a tongue longer than most people's feet? It's because the moth evolved over thousands of years and millions of years so that its tongue could reach the bottom of the nectar tubes of the star orchid, a flower unique to Madagascar. What's really amazing is that Darwin actually predicted that this insect existed long before it was ever found. In 1862, on a visit to Madagascar, he noticed the star orchid and said that surely there must be some insect that has adapted to slurp the nectar from the bottom of the outrageously long tubes. Sure enough, that very moth was witnessed for the first time in 1903, then properly recognized as a new species in 2021. Housebroken cows. For the first time in history, scientists have managed to potty train cows. Maybe useless and probably a waste of time, but fascinating nonetheless. The house training was done by a group of researchers in Germany and New Zealand. They took 16 baby cows and then taught them how to use the toilet in a latrine. They did this the same way you might train your dog to go to the toilet outside. They awarded the baby cows with treats when they went in the right spot. Then, after a while, if the cow would use the bathroom in an undesignated area, the scientists would spray them with an unpleasant-smelling water spray. The results of the study were absolutely amazing. It turns out that cows can learn how to use the potty quicker than human babies. Of course, most parents of potty training toddlers probably skip the water spraying method. This shows a few things that are key to understanding animal behavior. It shows that cows can control their natural reflexes when properly taught, and this would presumably transfer over to all kinds of other animals, such as goats, deer, pigs, and so on. Thanks for watching! Which of these discoveries shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!